run a workshop looking at some of the pressing issues regarding Indigenous data sovereignty today. So this year it was chosen to be Indigenous Data Sovereignty and AI. We were hosted by Colegio de Postgraduados in Texcoco, Mexico, and by Professor Oscar Luis Figueroa Rodriguez and his colleagues. So nau mai, haere mai ki tēnei kai whakarite o tēnei hui. It was held just recently at the end of February this year, and there were participants from all over the world, from different Indigenous data sovereignty groups. Approximately 60 of us attended, including the newly formed Latin America Data Sovereignty Group that were officially welcomed into the Rōpū at this workshop. So nau mai, haere mai I tēnei Rōpū. And the context was around how AI affects or may affect Indigenous data sovereignty in different settings and different kaupapa, and there were 7 that were discussed. And really for each of these 7 kaupapa, there was a facilitator and a scribe and a bunch of participants who just discussed various opportunities and risks that AI has with Indigenous data sovereignty in these different kaupapa. So in the first 4, our kai kōrerorero today will discuss what they found in those workshops. And before I hand it over to our first kai kōrerorero, Daniel, just note that we'll be taking questions at the end of this, at the end of the presentations. And if you've got any pressing questions, feel free to, or comments or anything, just feel free to chuck them into the chat. So tēnei te mihi atu ki a koutou katoa. Ka whiua te rākau ki a Daniel. Daniel.
Kia ora, Paul. Tēnā koutou katoa. Hiuri tēnei no Ngāpui me Ngāti Pikiao. Ko Daniel Wilson tōku ingoa. I teach and research in artificial intelligence and ethics and Māori data sovereignty, algorithmic sovereignty. In these slides, Larissa has helpfully put in a whole heap of photographs from our time at the GIDA workshop in Mexico. And so on the left is one of them, which was a pretty awesome tour through, this is Chipengo University, which was an agricultural university. We're walking towards one of the museum, which gave a whole history of agriculture in the region. You know, going back quite some time to traditional methods, and it's quite eye-opening. On the right-hand side, that's me at the Lake Mapere Utakuta River outlet. So whakapapa up north to southern Hokianga, and Utakuta Valley sits between Lake Mapere and the Hokianga Harbour. Right, so my topic, I was running a workshop with Maui Hudson on synthetic data. So we had a small wānanga there. If we could just move to the next slide there, thanks, Paul. Now, synthetic data, this is kind of, you know, there's a lot of familiarity around data, but now there's this concept of synthetic data, and it's somewhat new, but it captures a bunch of practices that have already been in use and some new ones that have been enabled by AI just in the last couple of years. So one of the motivations for this discussion of synthetic data is that as it's becoming more common to see it around, it's worth discussing what are the implications, because it's becoming a bit more of a term of art, but within mainstream discussions around data use. So, you know, what's an Indigenous perspective on this? So what is synthetic data? I've taken a definition from this World Economic Forum document. So this briefing paper, Maui Hudson was part of the team that was in this. It was an international paper. This is not, the link is there, but you can Google it, might be easier. But the definition is synthetic data refers to data that is generated by artificial means, such as statistical algorithmic methods or by AI. synthetic data is created rather than collected from real-world sources with the aim of addressing varied challenges of data unavailability, scarcity, privacy, or representativeness. So this is all quite abstract. What does that mean? And so maybe we can make it a bit more concrete with some of the examples down here. Some of these will be familiar and some of these will be new. So under the banner of synthetic data, you might get things like public tables of official statistics, so census and other surveys. In the process of making those tables public, the StatsNZ or whoever's doing the data processing will try and preserve individual privacy by adding some noise to things like the counts of people that fall under different categories. So that fits under this notion of synthetic data because you've got some sort of computational process that is manipulating the data to make it useful, in this case, putting it out in public, while at the same time preserving or protecting some element as well. So in this particular case, it's protecting individual privacy. Another practice that's been around for years and years is data preparation for creating AI models. So the computational processes that are used for creating AI, they don't like gappy data, a lot of them. And so that for years, people have been using various methods to impute fields. Like if you've got a whole heap of income and then there are some fields that don't have values in there, maybe you would use the mean income value or whatever it is. There are different decisions that get made for filling that in. Now, some of the new ones that have been, new forms of synthetic data that have been enabled by AI include things like simulations. So being able to generate data from AI. Now, some of this might be, based on existing statistical properties of, that have been recorded about communities or populations. But nevertheless, the data is representative of a group without specifically being that group, right? So you might create a fake, synthetic, population of the country, for instance, and there are some organizations that are working on that. So PHF, for example, have a real New Zealand simulator called ALMA. And then there are other practices like using large language models to, if you don't have survey participants from your demographic group or not enough, maybe having an LLM assume a persona and asking them the questions and see what comes back from that. So these kinds of methods are all sort of creeping in, and what we were looking at is, what are some of the issues around that? Next slide, please, Paul. Okay, so it's a mixed bag. So this question is, how might communities benefit from synthetic data? And, really the answer is if, they have control over synthetic data that's about their community. So it's been, long-standing claim in relation to Māori data sovereignty that, official statistics are of tremendous value to Māori communities if you're generating official statistics that serve Māori community aspirations, and so on with synthetic data as well, right? So for gaining information about your community or for planning, just for knowing where you're at or where you should put resources, that's invaluable. And same with AI, right? So synthetic data, you might need to augment some of the data in order to create your own AI models. And there are Māori organizations that are doing that. So this is some of its standard practice in here. And thirdly, there was that point that if there's data that's scarce or unavailable, maybe, those with appropriate authority and communities might decide that they will, create synthetic data to use the tools that are available in order to have some effect in their community, right? Just to avail themselves of the tools. Next slide, please. All right, so the downsides. So synthetic data in the mainstream, there's, there have been some forums where the notion of synthetic data means you don't need to, it's a way of bypassing having to engage, right? I haven't got this explicitly on this slide, but I do have it down the bottom here. If you can generate the data, well, then that saves a lot of effort in engaging with various groups and cost, right? So that's a risk that others will be generating data about communities. When there's discussion about privacy, often those who are creating synthetic data are interested in individual privacy. So, this is talking about official statistics, for instance. They're adding noise to protect individual privacy. But while the mainstream focus on individual privacy rights and individual consent is one thing, on the Indigenous side, we've got collective privacy, collective rights, and the synthetic data can impinge or infringe on these collective rights as well, right? So communities have a right to control what knowledge about them is available and who to. Also, this whole process of creating synthetic data, you've got judgments occurring all the way through. Decisions are being made. And if it's not to be completely disconnected from reality, it's going to have to be, grounded in grounded in the community themselves. So that transfers, the obligations to that community through into the synthetic data. So we still need to know the provenance of the original data and the various decisions made to create that synthetic data, right? Now, given, if you've got synthetic data created about Māori communities, there ought to be, if it's being used in tools that are having effect in these communities, then Māori communities should have power in the process of the creation of the synthetic data that fuels these tools, particularly artificial intelligence. And in the main, the way that synthetic data is treated is that it's just it is a useful fabrication, but actually this focusing on this output disguises the whole pathway of decisions and connection to the communities themselves, right? So this process should include Indigenous people in there. So just to note down the bottom here that all data sets, not just so-called, real data sets, but also synthetic data sets, they include social, political, and cultural context, and they have consequences in those domains. Right? So synthetic data should not be considered a replacement for working with communities. Final slide there, Paul. So what is a way forward? On the right here, you have, our working sheet. And at the end of the day, really the point was made that the care principles still apply, right? So through looking at the various risks, and the nature of synthetic data, we still have this need for collective benefit, right, for Indigenous communities, the authority to control, right, to control in terms of what data is known about communities and have control over the processes. There needs to be responsibility in the creation of synthetic data and its use, as well as ethics, tikanga. So these are as relevant as ever, right? And I think I'll leave it there. Kia ora.
Tēnā patai. Nei rā tumihi mai o Whāki a koutou katoa, ko tai mai nei. Ko tau gana hemi tōku nei ingoa. He uri whakaheke no te awa tupua, no Ngāti Rangi no Whanganui o ka tupuna. Hi, kia ora everyone. My name is Logan. I am a researcher at Whakaoi Research Services, Ngāti Hauātili Health Research Centre, and a member of Te Pokapū of Te Mana Raraunga. I'm going to be sharing about the capacity and capability session that we had. I would acknowledge first and foremost that I wasn't the facilitator of the session. That was Bobby Mayer of Mana Raraunga, which is kind of the Australian-based alternative to Mana Raraunga, and also Riley Taiting Fong, of the US Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network. I was merely the note taker, but I hope to honor their contributions in this talk. So next slide, please, Paul. I wanted to do some kind of context building around the focus on cap and cap, and kind of what do we mean by capacity and capability in the context of IDSov and AI. So obviously most of us would be very familiar with the context of AI being a hot topic at the moment, with a lot of focus on implementation, for example, of AI tools and kind of through government, kind of central organizations, but also private organizations. So most of us are experiencing AI in ways that may feel coercive, but also thinking about, therefore, a really strong need for how to upskill our communities to think around AI and their relationships to AI, particularly as some communities are really interested in leveraging it to support their aspirations. So when we talk about capacity, what I mean by that is kind of the available time, resources, and energy to support a kaupapa. And when I say capability, that really focuses on the knowledge, skills, and tools to enable that. So in the relationship to IDSov and AI, what we're really thinking about, or what we were thinking about in this session, was how do we build capacity and capability within Indigenous communities in relationship to AI? How do we support our communities to understand the opportunities and eventual risks of AI? And then how do we build capacity and capability within AI and tech spaces in relation to IDSov and IDGov? So recognizing that a lot of the tools that are being implemented within organizations are not from our communities, but occur within kind of the tech space. How do we ensure that they have an understanding of IDSov and IDGov? And then finally, thinking about the kind of systems of power within each of our respective spaces. How do we build capacity and capability within policy, legislation, or mechanisms of power in relation to Indigenous perspectives on AI? So how do we ensure that our ideas and approaches and thoughts around AI are shaping and influencing those mechanisms of power, particularly as they relate to Aotearoa for this context? So lots of big ideas. We only had 2 hours to get through some of these ideas, so I can't kind of canvas the full breadth, but I really invite questions at the end. And for the talk, I'm just going to focus on the barriers and then the opportunities that came out of the discussion. So next slide, please, Paul. As it came to the barriers and risks, lots of people felt strongly around some of the challenges of transparency within AI, particularly generative AI, in relation to the code itself and like where that data is kind of being taken from and what shapes and informs that, and how that kind of creates this idea of kind of AI as kind of advanced or futuristic, kind of mysterious, and therefore like powerful, and kind of that lack of knowledge from communities kind of enables kind of the kind of major kind of tech forces within this context to sell this vision with limited opportunities for community to ask questions from that space of full awareness. And then kind of building from that, kind of AI tools are not being developed by our communities in the main, for the most part. But often we're using them or having to use them, we're to use them to access services, for example. So, thinking about, use of note-taking, AI note-taking as a tool in lots of health services nowadays. That often the expectation is that you will kind of say yes to that because that would kind of be inconveniencing the kind of health professional you're seeking services from. And even when it comes to a desire to build AI tools within community, there's often a lack of infrastructure or tools within those organizations and with those communities. And this was something that was really present for our relations in, say, the US, Canada, or Australia, where kind of remote communities may have even really constrained access to internet, let alone all of the infrastructure to support, say, true kind of data sovereignty and where data can be housed on country. Building from this, limited mātanga, experts in the area who can support the next generation. In Aotearoa, we are in a relatively privileged position compared to others who are able to join the gathering, and that we have a recognized collective. I had a photo of Te Saka Keegan in the previous slide, who was able to join us in Mexico. That's really powerful in terms of being able to sell a vision. Thank you for the reference, Paul. There's Te Taka there. It's a great shirt on. But that was really a gap. And even when, in our context, we kind of had 3 at Mexico, that stretches their ability to connect deeply with people, and that they're often having to go and give talks or have very short engagements with communities to kind of give as much knowledge and advice as they can while trying to spread that widely. And then kind of thinking more structurally, given that AI is increasingly becoming the default option in lots of spaces, recognizing that in each of our collectives, we're already behind in setting up safeguards and supports to maintain and enact IDSov and IDGov across many contexts. And I really like this quote. This quote comes from one of the members from the United States Indigenous Data Sovereignty Alliance that says that I worry that efforts to build literacy and educate tribes and Indigenous communities on AI will slip into deficit model framings or be done in ways that try to manufacture consent to existing texts rather than put tribes in positions of authority to inform decisions about AI. And how I thought that connected was that, if we're feeling like we have to rush this work to respond to an urgent need, then, we might kind of just default to, okay, AI exists, so therefore we need to do AI. And a lot of the thought was, how do we engage in a very measured way with AI, recognizing its strengths 100%, but not assuming that communities want to engage with AI in all the same ways that other communities might. So that's some of the barriers and risks. Next slide, please. And then obviously thinking about the opportunities. And this is around how to build capacity and capability rather than the opportunities of AI. So really there was a recognition of a need to invest in infrastructure and talent pipelines. And this kind of being complex, right? In that often the way that this has been facilitated is through, say, universities or through tech companies. How do we create those relationships or build our own? And we have some nice examples through Te Raraunga of how they have built a pipeline for building capacity and capability for embedding data sovereignty and how iwi can analyze data that's relevant to them. But what might that look like within the AI tech space specifically? And then thinking about kind of addressing that kind of black box, the mystery of AI. So what workshops or training or resources could there be that are tailored to local communities that address their needs and aspirations? And recognizing that that will need time and space for people to create. And then thinking about, okay, well, in the short term, how do we focus on tools, recognizing there are lots of communities who use, for example, ChatGPT. What are our alternatives that may align better with IDSov practices and principles? And then thinking about, what is AI or what is Gen AI? Even just providing that baseline awareness as a useful first step. And again, kind of codifying that Indigenous AI governance. We have some of that through Te Raraunga that we were sharing, but developing some kind of clearer protocols that can enable that kind of uptake in organizations will be a really useful translation of that material. And again, I want to kind of signal what Paul talked about earlier, just the opportunities through sharing across different networks across the globe, and being able to kind of witness some moments in history. So one of the, the most significant moments I had in that session was the actual foundation of GIDA Latin America. So the Latin American collective coming together before our very eyes, and that session being a really powerful example of how capacity and capability can be built up. And, I imagine that is a moment that then is passed down through their collectives over time. Next slide, please. Very briefly, I just want to acknowledge the next steps. That's HappyCap is ongoing. I'm sure we will signal this again at the end, but one of the first things we want to do is release a communique on AI and IDSov, which represents our position around all of kind of GIDA. The next is kind of pulling together a special issue around AI and IDSov, so trying to kind of focus on that as a tool for building capacity and capability. And then lastly, in the Aotearoa context, wanting to hold a local gathering around this topic in February of 2027 that can kind of help build more of a focus on that testing capability in Aotearoa. And I will leave it there and pass it on to the next speaker, Kia ora.
Kia ora tātou. So I got the privilege of facilitating the workshop on governance, equity, and preventing extractive social practices. Tēnā tātou hiuria hau no te rarawa ngā pui Waikato Tainui me Ngāti Pawa hau. Next slide, please, Paul. So what do we mean by that? I feel like a lot of different workshops were facilitated in very interesting ways, and I felt like because GIDA is a network of Indigenous networks, that a global Indigenous context and defining what that means is quite important, and then bringing that back to our local nations and seeing how this reflects with our own aspirations is quite important. So when thinking about Indigenous data governance of AI, we thought about this as the structures, processes, and authorities that determine how Indigenous data is accessed, used, and controlled in AI contexts. So governance includes who has the power to make decisions about data at local, national, and international spheres, and how consent is given or withheld, and how Indigenous communities assert their rights and maintain control over their data, knowledge, resources in the face of external pressures. Next slide, people. So we also kind of had definitions for equity, and then we kind of moved more into preventing extractive practices as the practical implications. So we talked more around how people in capacity are needed to build equity so that we can provide the tools for decision makers. We talked about there potentially being templates and shells built by us for the community to share. And so examples of shells and templates to be built is really similar to what Professor Titaka Keegan, he's going to come up a lot in this, demonstrated and highlighted with, he's looking to create a meta-specific language learning model. And so how having just the shells of things are all we really need to then to create community-driven resource. Another example is a really interesting one about how Donald Trump, when he was kicked off of all of the different social medias, created his own version of social media. And while that was a terrible thing and it didn't really work, we now potentially have a template and a shell to build our own Indigenous ways of creating social media. And so there are interesting ways that we can think about equity in the way that we do things very uniquely from our own nations. And so templates and shells built by us for the community to share and then input their knowledge into means that we can create safer ways for us to then continue on into the AI kind of world. So high-level decisions still need the local acknowledgements. That's a major part of our equity of AI for Indigenous peoples. And no extraction of land brought, or downriver extremes are acceptable in equity situations for Indigenous peoples. And so we recycled the reduce, reuse, recycle, the beautiful 3 R's we know, and kind of put it into respect, responsibility, and reciprocity. So preventing extractive practices. This was kind of, once again, kind of getting into the more, how are we defining these extractive social practices? And so we, in the room, workshopped that ensuring that AI development does not exploit Indigenous data, knowledge, languages, or cultural expressions without consent, compensation, or benefit sharing are really important to preventing this social extraction. This means moving away from extractive models towards processes grounded in Indigenous protocols, informed consent, reciprocity, and respect for Indigenous rights. Next slide, please. And so the final thought from me was, how can AI and IDSov and IDGov coexist? And so we wanted some really nice, good practice examples that we could pull together from all of our different nations and from all of the networks that we create as GIDA, to say that there are other potential avenues that we can talk about this for good, because I do feel like we move into doom and gloom often, or we move to the other end of the spectrum, but what are some good operational things that we have? And so our Canadian colleagues talked about the Indigenous elder holograms that were telling their stories that they have currently going. We talk about the extraction of traditional knowledge as one of the scariest kind of things that's currently happening with AI, but what are ways that we can think about that differently? Most of the resource use happens when the model is built. So how can we make sure that we're not talking about how AI is used in very extractive ways in other spaces? So having technical expertise and expert knowledge kind of helps us unpack some of the myths that we have around AI already, or that we're creating. Recognizing closed data, intellectual property, traditional knowledge, and collective rights. There's the 3 R's again. And also the definition of Indigenous AI as non-extraterritorial was quite important. There's a lot to kind of unpack with each of these. I really should have thought about that. Provide benefit, obviously, big one. Create a Māori Facebook for Māori comms, I think was one of the fun ones that we talked about quite a bit. Because we need to be making people aware that our knowledge is being extracted from social media. So no more pictures of our tupuna up in a Facebook group, please. As kind of like our last cheeky comments to think about social extraction. Kia ora. And I will pass the rako on to Corey.
Mihi ana kia koutou katoa, e hono mai rā ki tēnei kōrero. Koi ruha tōku ingoa, he uri tēnei e whakaheke no Te Aroa Waka. Yep, kia ora everyone, my name is Koi Ruha, and I hail from around the central North Island, mai maketu ki Tongariro. And my background is in a lot of environmental data and working with my iwi around Rotorua. And I joined up with Te Mana Raraunga through Te Pokapū maybe a year ago. And through that, I was able to come to Mexico, to Mexico, and join and run a workshop on sustainability. So apologies for how chaotic this slide looks. It was built about an hour ago, and I was listening to some weird music, so it got me in a weird mood, so nothing looks straight or even. So firstly, I wanted to know, when I was going to run this session, a bit of context. What was the thinking around sustainability? Because I obviously am in the Taiao space, and I'm constantly thinking about how Taiao ties in with people and spirituality, and that's my jam. But what does GIDA think when it's thinking about sustainability? Because it can be a bit of a buzzword. So in terms of that train of thought, they were more thinking of extractivism, the impacts of AI on the environment, and those physical dimensions from the environmental burden of AI. So I was like, okay, cool. We can work with that, or work in that space. And we're trying to address from each of our different perspectives what sustainability is. So this was a bilingual session, really cool. We had a bunch of translators in the room, and it was giving UN, like real cool vibes. And it was it was amazing to have so many different voices in the room and be able to connect in that way. So just for the rest of the slides, we've separated our session into 2 groups just to make it more fluid. So we had our Latin American homies who could speak in the same or common languages between Portuguese and Spanish. And then we had our homies who were able to communicate in English. And so that was Africa, the Pacific, and North America. So if we could go into the next slide, please, Paul. Hold up. So what is sustainability to you? That's something that we wanted to address first of all. I thought it was really cool to see there was a bit of a difference between the two. Everything was shared, no one disagreed on anything, but the focus was different. When we were talking with our Latin American crew, they were really invested in thinking generationally and supporting and investing in the next generation. They wanted to look for how we incorporate justice for Indigenous people in place and spirituality, as well as economic justice for everything that's happened due to colonization. And when they think about a system that is sustainable, They're thinking about something with feedback and reflection points, places where you can stop, pause, and reflect and change the system if need be. So that to them was where they're head at with sustainability. And this is just coming from notes written in Spanish and me trying to interpret that as well. And also my memory of the translation of when we were there. And so from our APA crew, we had thinking about the life cycle of all parts of everything in a sustainable system, and that also requiring reciprocity. So how can reciprocity happen in the space of data and AI? So if there is extraction, how do we return that and provide balance? We want to give more voices to mountains, to water, to earth. And there was also the thought that it's more so humanity and people are the issue, not we don't need to manage the earth and the resources. We actually need to manage people and how we exploit and extract. Next slide, please. So here were just some main points that came through in our session. So for our Latin Americans, they were talking about spiritual cleansing, so relationship building, dialogues with communities, specifically for research and for government to build relationships and build dialogues with territories and with tribes, and also bringing that Indigenous technical capacity to the front. And so all of the people who have the skills, bringing them forward. And then also you've got that capability building, which is what you need also. Using technologies to help, to protect, and to hold space for a new dimension of our indigeneity. So this new space of data could be a whole new aspect of how we express ourselves as Indigenous people. And then there were some really cool examples, especially in the Amazon, about how they're using AI for mapping deforestation and holding people to account for planting projects and other types of environmental and social good and cultural good, I'll add as well. And then for our APA, we've got thinking about how precious earth taonga or resources are being extracted for data centers, creating a sickness in Papatūānuku. And so if, ko au te whenua, ko te whenua ko au, if I'm the land and the land is sick, then what's that make me? And that was across different cultures as well, all agreeing on that. And also thinking about how we need to be aware of how these models are being trained and what they're being used, or if they're being weaponized. And I know just for a lot of, say, trusts in the Māori farming sort of sector are worried about how AI could be utilized by government or weaponized to try and change how they do things on their whenua. So that was just one quick example. Next slide, please. And so what's up? Where to from here? For our Latin American crew, they were wanting to come together and form a network, which, as Paul mentioned, they were able to. So our Latin American Data Sovereignty Network was born out of this, which is super exciting. GIDA needs to clarify its position on AI, and was really hoping for some way that this is actually a starting point to create better global connection between each other. And that's something both groups agreed on, is that we actually need something tangible, something feasible for us to connect together and draw off each other's experience. And a big part of that call was from one of our Colombian cousins. He was saying that we need to be really hyper aware of the fact that, for example, Aotearoa is so much further on this journey than Colombia is, And he really wanted to draw attention to that, and I had so much love and respect for that, and want everyone to be continually focusing on how we can help others on this journey that we've done so many hard yards in. And then just to add on to that, our APA people reinforced the thought that Indigenous leaders in all spaces need to drive this for our people. And drive this, I mean, drive the importance of the environment, not just sustainability, but how we interact with the taiao, and the trifecta of excellence, which is taiao, health, and education, all those three things combined together. Yes, I think that's the last slide.
Tēnei te mihi atu ki ngā kai kōrero I tēnei rā. Nā koutou I whakatairanga I tō mātou wairua ki o mahi I roto I te kaupapa o Indigenous Data Sovereignty and AI. So thank you very much to our kai kōrero today for their for facilitating and participating in as representatives of Te Mana Raraunga in the GIDA space. And right now I'd like to open it up to the floor if there are any questions or any comments. I'll just check the chat. It's coming up now. So we don't have any partai in the chat yet, but are there any partai from the floor? Otherwise, I can start us off with the partai to all of our kai kōrero. Actually, let me just stop sharing this. So I liked how there was, in the bilingual sessions, Corey, you were talking about, you've got your peeps from Pacifica and North America, et cetera, and Latin America. In our workshops, did we notice any specific differences between some of the networks and how they felt about different opportunities and risks in the context of their kind of in their ropu, in their environment, in their tile, for instance?
I can start first from my observations from Cap and Cap. And I think it's less about, maybe AI is the context that this is shown in, but like I think it speaks to a broader phenomenon. In that, I think what I noticed is that, within Aotearoa, obviously we talk about specificity as iwi and as hapu, but there's still that collective of Māori through which we can kind of gather together and kind of build momentum and direction towards a kind of shared goal. I think a reflection from lots of the other networks is that it was more complex than that, and that was really reflected through some of the Canadian representatives thinking about the space for First Nations, for Métis, and then for Inuit relationships, and then how some of their collectives were represented as authorities of, say, like the First Nations FNIGC, having a clear mandate from their nation versus the Métis were representing kind of themselves as individuals, but also thinking about from a Métis perspective. There were lots of different complexities that meant that how they approached and responded to the questions within capacity and capability were constrained by those different realities. So that was like one major reflection I had in Cap and Cap was that obviously there's complexity and lack of resources that's different across Aotearoa, but we still have that unity around being Māori that could help us build towards something. I'll pass it over for others as well to share their reflections.
I'll just say quickly, I thought it was pretty interesting in our session. It was bilingual. We had Latin Americans, we had English speakers, and the ones from Latin America were a lot of their conversation and a lot of their points were very, I'm not sure if it came through in the slides, but they were actually very hopeful and very positive. And the ones from everywhere else majority were quite negative and dark. And it was, I drew it down to the fact that the ones in Latin America actually don't really have this position where they have like a very good relationship with, say, government, and they're not needing to like fight really like nitpicky battles about everything yet. And they might get there, or they might do it differently, but a lot of others are like, say, us and Canada are in this space where we're just like, we're in talks with government and we're like, banging heads together on a lot of stuff. Whereas a lot of what the Latin Americans are doing, they've just gotten this cool new tool which they're utilizing for their people directly for their communities, that they're like, wow, like they're just straight on the ground, all about community, and it's not really in that bigger space yet of working with government. So it was just interesting to see, like, and I sort of draw it against what's Starlink, and Elon Musk, and think what you want about him, I think he's a knob, and I'm allowed to think that because I can get internet from any other way. But for really remote communities, it's a really cool thing that connects them, so yeah, it was just interesting to see that difference of where we're at. So that was my thought.
Yeah, look, I have to total you there, Corey. I do feel like a lot of the pessimism in the room is definitely coming from the west, the northern hemisphere, and I do think that one of the interesting things about having a network created of Indigenous networks is that you're thinking constantly from a community and localized base, but you're having to then turn that and then face into this international network of networks. And so having conversations around equity and governance looks so different because everyone has done governance in such a different and unique way because colonization was different for all of us. And so understanding where people sit depend completely on the context of a lot of the colonial histories that they shared. And so we also had lots of different experts that are coming from this subject from different areas. I had a few professors in the room for me who talked about governance because they'd sat on different governance boards and they'd recognized that actually the expertise that they had in this area was because of the amount of governance spaces they were sitting in. And so it was interesting to see, I'm sitting here thinking I talk about stuff that happens from a whānau, I talk about stuff that happens from a community. I might sit in and listen to some of the meeting minutes from my hapu, but I've never sat in a governance kind of position in regards to that. And so thinking from lots of different perspectives and then also from lots of different nations makes it such an interesting space to try and define what the term governance actually was. And I think that's why we spent almost half the session just talking about how do we define this as GIDA, and then how do we take this back and bring it in, relocalize our Indigenous contexts to make sure that they are the shared aspirations of our whānau and our hapu and our iwi when we talk about governance. But yeah, I do agree. I think it was very UN energy to have the bilingual, and I think it's really important that Indigenous communities are not just using, not only English-speaking Indigenous communities should be sitting in a space and having these conversations, and that other Indigenous communities around the world who do not speak English should also be at the table. And it was a real privilege to be a part of the Latin American crew coming together. And it was a real privilege to see the way that, all these different translators had to go to work and we're all sitting there with headphones and listening to each other talk. It was quite powerful. It was really important work. But yeah, hopefully that answered the question.
Kia ora. We've got a few pātai from the chat. From Karina, have we had any interest from New Zealand-based corporations or major businesses about embedding Māori data sovereignty principles or iwi enterprises? anyone from Te Mana, well, any of us want to take that question on? Just quickly? I mean, I can say that we do get emails and pārtai from as Te Mana Raraunga from iwi and businesses. From businesses and also from government entities. I do get it from New Zealand Police from time to time. I think that's been our collective experience for the most part. Is that about right?
I think I can.
Oh, sorry, you go.
No, you go.
The reason why I'm asking is, have you actually had an organisation who said, yeah, I want to take this, I want to be able to apply that to any systems that I'm using and, work with you on that? Any interest from any of our big corporations, banks, or, tourism operators, or even iwi organisations who are, doing commercial activities as well?
I do think we have a lot of different New Zealand-based corporations and major businesses come and try and have kōrero with us. And sometimes it feels like there will be a genuine partnership, and other times it feels like they just want us to tick box something to say that they've done the thing. And so it's hard to think about, okay, how many resources do we have as a network of people who are not doing this for any monetary gain, but actually are just really data nerds and data ethicists in the space, who has the time and capacity to treat each interest that kind of comes our way with the time and space that it sometimes needs. And for some, you can kind of read through the lines and go, oh yeah, this is a tick to say that you've done something cultural. And for others, there is a real interest in, actually, this is how I've read your Māori data sovereignty principles. These are the ways that I'm thinking of incorporating them within our business or within our space. And those are the ones that we usually are spending a lot more time having kōrero with and facilitating into tautokoing. But a lot of the time, it can definitely look like a tick box, or there's potential for us to put in a lot of energy just to kind of, oh, well, we just want to meet with you for an hour and you to tell us what this is so that we can say that we've done the thing. And so we kind of do sit in that interesting space because of that. But a lot of our iwi actually work closely with Te Kahuraranga because they are mandated by the Iwi Chess Forum. And so a lot of the work that we do sits within a framework of mana and mahi. And Te Kahuraranga hold the mana, and they have that authority, and they've been mandated by the Iwi Chess Forum. And a lot of the mahi stuff sits with us, where we will go in, we will do the work, the mahi, and say the things that we're allowed to say outspokenly because we don't have that type of mandate for us. So yeah, hopefully that answers that for you, Karina.
Hi, yes, thank you. Ngā mihi.
Tēnā koroa. Got another one here. Ngā mihi Xavier mō ngā kupu aroha. Ane te pātai, what are your opinions on the use of synthetic data? Seems like an interesting concept. It is my first time hearing about it. Daniel, do you have any kōrero on this?
Yeah. So I think it's a new term to package something up that actually is presenting it as something fresh, that somehow means we have to start again with thinking about the implications. But as I said in the presentation, all of the synthetic data has got some sort of computational processing in it. And we already have frameworks like the Māori AI governance framework from Te Kahuraranga. These kinds of things relate to that same process of generating synthetic data. So even though the term's new, the issues, we've already been working through them. The same questions apply. So yeah, the scope of application is really broad, but we've already, have a lot of thinking around Māori algorithmic sovereignty and governance frameworks. So, hold fast to this, right? If somebody's bringing up synthetic data as a way to bypass all of that.
Yeah, it's interesting because synthetic data, or the process of data simulation has been around for quite a while now. I mean, since computers were able to actually do it. I mean, in theory, as statisticians have been using or have known about it for years, but when you're bringing it into the field of applications on people, applications to our tile, it takes on quite a whole new dimension there. And I suppose for me, as like a statistician, it would depend on it definitely depends on the context of how you're using it and for what purpose. But thank you for that, Daniel. A couple of others before we head off. Was there any mention of data centers being bad for the environment? And if so, what are alternatives for organizations? I can tell you, I was lucky enough to facilitate the Indigenous, or the data trade and digital trade and identity, and the concept of the concept came up of distributed computing, where you have, instead of one large data center eating up all of the resources, there may be opportunities to build infrastructure where you've got smaller pockets of distributed compute or computing that feeds into the algorithms, such that they're you're not eating up all the resources in one place, and that the resources are being distributed, or the use of resources being distributed. So a little bit of talk around digital infrastructure and the building of digital infrastructure has been quite key to ensuring that there are some of the negative effects of all of the computational resources that eat up our environmental resources are kind of distributed a bit more fairly. I'm not sure, Corey, if there's anything that was mentioned in your session about it.
No, not necessarily, but I agree with your point, and like decentralized storage systems and say like micro data centers as well as another alternative. And when we were talking before about what types of people have gotten in touch with us, there was even talk about one hapu who got in touch, and they were wanting to build their own data center on the East Coast. And there's been talk about building a micro data center in Rotorua as well. And yeah, so it's a thing that's happening that people can take charge of. And yeah, that's definitely a beautiful alternative to drawing on vast amounts of energy to power those larger data centers.
Tēnei te mihi, kia Inji, who's in with us for her mahi on digital infrastructure and the idea of distributed computing in our session. Just one last one. What message could we share with non-Indigenous organizations taking giant leaps into utilizing AI, having good intentions, but still at its infancy in terms of understanding Indigenous data sovereignty? Have we got any final quarter or final messages for those businesses?
Do the mahi first before you go and ask someone. And I think that's kind of like a basic 101 for many non-Indigenous spaces, to just do the mahi first before coming to people to ask them for their opinion, because their opinion will be surrounded in context that you don't necessarily have unless you've done that mahi. That's like me going up to Linda Smith, not knowing anything about kaupapa Māori research, being like, what's that thing that you do? Like it's not tika, don't do it. Do a little bit of mahi first and then go, this is what I think I've gotten from this. How can I engage meaningfully in a way that doesn't simply extract all this information from you? But I think another thing too is a lot of our Māori work in a lot of non-Indigenous spaces that are trying to do these things, and it sets them up in a really complicated space to be the designated Māori to go off and do all the tikanga things. And so it's fraught with a lot of complexity. And I think there is a lot of space to be Māori in a non-Māori space, but then have to pick up that poke because you recognise it's very important. So for the Māori who are doing that, kia kaha, it's a hard space to sit in, but also you can only take it as far as you can take it because you are the only Māori. Don't feel like everything has to then sit on you, because I think there's a lot of emotions that can come up in that space too for you. Does anyone else have any final kōrero for this?
I think that sums it up really nicely. Unfortunately, our time is up. Just got time for a quick closing karakia, which I'll give now. Unuhia, unuhia, unuhia ki te uru tapu nui. Kia wātea, kia mama te ngākau te tinana, te wairua I te ara takatu. Ko ia rā e rongo whakaeria ake ki runga, kia wātea, aira, kua wātea, rire, rire hau, pai marire. Kia ora koutou.